All right, everybody, welcome once again to this very important stream of consciousness where we're going to take a look at Saturn and Pisces. Now, there's a long history of Saturn and Pisces. As you can imagine, it moves cyclically. And basically, what it means is that it moves into the sign of Pisces, where it will be in the ruling capacity in that sign for the next 3 years. Well, what does it mean? Well, first of all, you have to take the archetype of both Saturn and Pisces, right? And there is the combination that Saturn and Pisces speaks about the generational part that Saturn, as a generational planet, plays with that placement in Pisces. We're going to actually talk about some of the history here in a second. But then you also have the aspect of what it means for you personally. Well, personally, it's the combination of Saturn in Pisces plus your personal house, right? And how do you configure that? Well, what is the house system but starting with the ascending? So as much as it may affect sun signs, what it will also do is affect the rising signs more because it will end up being its house placement. And before the end of this video, we're going to talk about those house placements for each one of the risings. But first, let's talk about the archetype of beautiful Saturn. Saturn is the furthest object in our solar system that is visible by the naked eye. You can walk outside and see Saturn. Well, Saturn, in some of its greatest hits over the last couple of years, as it moved through Aquarius, allowed us to really kind of recognize as a beginning call signal for what many astrologers feel was the beginning of the age of Aquarius. If we believe that there are shadow times for, say, retrogrades or placements into houses, then we definitely should believe that the shadow time of Aquarius really started to happen with the powerhouse of Saturn. Don't forget, in 2020, when Saturn was conjunct with Jupiter on December 21st, 2020, that was by and large what a lot of people called, or a lot of astrologers at least really kind of pointed to say, like, hey, this is a precursor. This is some of the stuff that we should expect with Saturn into Aquarius next time around, which is when we will walk into the age of Aquarius, right? So the other dynamic here for this is that Saturn in Pisces actually has a very long-standing attribute for social upheaval, for things like belief systems, for things like civil unrest. Because when you look at the dichotomy of what those two archetypes are, of both Saturn and Pisces, they're actually creating duality. And that is something that we don't always do well with. And energetically, there's a push and a pull all the time, right? For instance, Saturn is about stability. It is about foundation. It is about law. It is about the sternness, the father, if you will. Where Pisces is kind of the playful, immature energy that allows us to explore things and question things and develop, both in spirituality and in our thought process. Well, Saturn comes in and says, this is the way you do it. And Pisces says, yeah, well, we'll see about that. There's bound to be some conflict. Now, on a social level, there'll be a ton of turmoil. I mean, that's just astrology for you. But in a personal level, when you take a look at where this is happening for you in your house, what it's going to mean is that push and pull is going to create dynamic tension for you to be able to grow. As much of a pain in the ass as Saturn in Pisces can be energetically, it's also very necessary for personal growth. That's the part you need to remember as we move along. Now, let's go back to Saturn here for a second. Saturn is actually represented by the archetype. In tarot, it is the devil. It is the things in which we are bound to in this 3D world. It is the obligations. It is the perpetual thing of like death and taxes and all the things of responsibility that sit within us. It's also the things that keep us restrictive. So there's the understanding of, like, the devil card sitting here, of being in bondage, of being in restriction, of being playing by the rules. Now, by contrast, we actually have the Piscean card of the moon sitting here, Well, the Piscean energy of the moon is about dreams, it's about illuminating creativity, it's about flowing with intuition and understanding. Well, guess what? These two dual energies are working for and against us all the time. Instead of thinking about it as problems or breakdowns or that sort of thing, start looking at it as dynamic tensions for you to be able to grow. Now, what does this also mean for us in the cosmic level? Well, a little bit of a history lesson, and I'm going to pull up my notes, so do forgive me because I can't remember everything. Well, I can, but I would be spending so much time in so many other ways. So you've got, the historical Saturn in Pisces. And what you need to really kind of understand is that the archetype of that has been a long withstanding component for us to grow in a societal sort of way, right? In ancient Greece in 594 BCE, this is when Athens started to become the idea of a structured democracy, an Athenian democracy. This is when it kind of came into be. Well, how did it come into be? Well, Athens started to say, you know what? We need to create structure and we're going to be creative about it. And that is how the Greek city states of Athens and Sparta and all that other stuff started to come into effect. So that's one of the social aspects that could come out of this, kind of a new government. Calm down, conspiracy theorists. Take a deep breath. We're not going there, not yet. Wait till Neptune gets involved in a couple of years. But historically speaking, what this means for us is that we have to kind of keep our head on a swivel when it comes to the ideas of the social change, because also Sparta also kind of came into this with idealistic reforms in around 24, 240, 242 BC, where it was beginning to understand how like land systems needed to work. So again, you had this thing where like the land is free, but we need kind of structure and rules so we're not stepping on each other. So this is another example. Now, fast forward into medieval times where Saturn was in Pisces from February 1258 to 1261. This is when the Mongol Empire was really spreading throughout Europe, right? And it was beginning to threaten other world cultures. It was starting to threaten things like Islam. It was starting to, it basically took over, the Near East. I mean, they took over the Middle East by and large into parts of Iran and Iraq and what are modern Iran, Iraq. But what you also have to understand is that it also allowed them to say, that's it, we need to have our own structure. It's actually part of the reason why, if there's militant parts of even Christianity and in Islamic, folklore, this is where it kind of stemmed from. It was during this time where they needed to say, you know what, we're not going to let people in from the outside. And it made them very parochial. It is when the walls at Jericho were reinstituted. It's when it's when there became the 5 pillars, where the 5 pillars were being actually backed up, if you will. And then you get into other times where you also had this social plague thing going on. You had the Black Plague that came in the mid 1300s, 1346 to 1349, when the Black Plague finally reached Europe and it became a worldwide epidemic, right? It became a pandemic. Yes, it was a true pandemic. And by the way, it resonated from the Mongol Empire. It resonated from parts of China. So sorry, everybody. That's how they kind of deciphered it. But then you also had things like papal power being questioned in the mid 1300s. This was at a time when the church was really being challenged, because it's gone about 900 years since Constantine said, no, we're going to connect us to the Holy Roman Empire. And then there was beginning to have questions that actually planted the seeds of things like, the Protestant Reformation that still wouldn't happen for a few hundred years. But these were the seeds that really kind of came into it. Also, social and politically, you had the Renaissance go on, because the next time that Pisces housed Saturn was from March of 1346 to February of 1349. That was actually the Black Plague. But then again, in 1494 to 1496, this is when the Renaissance really took over. This was also a time of Da Vinci. This was a time of Bosch. This was at a time where we were beginning to kind of like, now granted, the pandemic was still going on with the Black Plague, but it was also like, forget about that. We have fatigue with the pandemic and we're going to start to create again. This is where Da Vinci was actually taking his stuff. This is where you saw a lot of mixed modalities kind of come into play. I'm setting the stage here for our current Saturn in Pisces, but it allowed for us to say, well, the physician isn't always the physician. They're also the astrologer and astronomer and the herbalist and the so forth and so on. Because then you also have, the time from 1523 to 1526, which is when you had the Chinese come into Ming dynasties, where the dynasties started to really kind of take hold and push back things like the Mongol Empire was defeated. You also had things that were Martin Luther, started his Protestant Reformation. See how we're kind of growing into that, because later on, the next transit was in 1552 to 55. And this is where things really started to kind of grow, where faith and religion was no longer something that was held in power, where it started to kind of make a transfer into, you've got to appeal to the people. So you see these transitions of faith and religion, structures of faith that end up really kind of changing, right? Well, listen, we ended up with 1640 to 1643, and we ended up where Puritanism was getting outcasted. This is when the Mayflower started to set sail. This is when the Protestant Reformation and the Catholic strongholds were definitely at bay with one another. They were definitely in, they were definitely in a position where they were at odds, both philosophically and just kind of like organically. It was kind of like the red door was the sin and the establishment was the bad thing. The countercultures started to kind of rise. This is the important part of this. Forget about Protestant and Catholic. It was the counterculture that started to rise. So when Saturn goes into Pisces, it gives us an opportunity to take a look at structures, no matter how old they are, and start to kind of pick them apart, because these are the energetic things that come along with it. Well, by the way, if you like the Renaissance, you're going to love, absolutely adore, rather, that from 1729 to 1732, we had this idea of the Age of Enlightenment, right? We had this part where we were expanding things to really kind of understand, like, what else is out there. We also had, the formation of things like the Freemasons. So you have kind of this undercurrent belly, this counterculture thing again, where the Freemasons were trying to uphold a standard regardless of what political value, no matter what religious affiliation. They were trying to create a standard, and they were going back to math. They were going back to the level 33. They were trying to create standards that you might not have bought into it, but they created a standard that they held near. That's an important thing to think of here as we move into this. Now, as we get closer here into, into modern times, another stop off at 1758 to 61, which I think I can't remember if I just mentioned this. This is the Age of Enlightenment. This is where Voltaire was writing all of his work. This is where Hume was speaking in the gardens. Kew Gardens we're beginning to understand that, like, botanical wonders should be the foundation of something, and rich people, whether they felt guilty or not, decided to begin to open up their wealth to other people, which was very much not a thing that was happening before that time, right? And then, of course, you had the French Revolution. The next time Saturn went into Pisces, 1788 to 1791, the French Revolution really kind of kicked off, right? And it was a fight against land ownership. It was the feudal system that they were really trying to fight against. They were trying to reconcile the idea of representative government as well as understanding where things were going to go moving forward. This is where, like, William Blake ended up writing, Marriage of Heaven and Hell, which was really about, his vision of where things were supposed to go from, I stopped short of calling it utopian, but to be able to say, like, hey, we have a higher power here. We're arguing about who the higher power is. Just know that the higher power is there. That's the kind of product that we can expect when Saturn goes into Pisces, right? So then you kind of fast forward the next time in 1817 to 1820, we had the Industrial Revolution. I mean, so you want a revolution. How many times do we have to talk about this, right? Saturn into Pisces is a time of revolution, of social upheaval and advancement. Whether you like it or not, it's going to change. Because during this time, during the Industrial Revolution, this is when things really started to kind of take off when it came to things that were about improvements of life. This is in the United States, it was the root of when abolition started. Now, it still took a few years to take effect, but this is where the discussion started, right? Don't forget that this is a time, not necessarily of coming to fruition, but sometimes in astrology, it's a time where the seed was planted. This is the perfect time for seed to be planted, right? You also had the understanding that some of the things that were happening were really about the uneasiness of, you're just coming off of Napoleon. You're just coming off of, the French Revolution. You're just coming off of some of the United States kind of still kind of waving their flag around, although we've had another, Saturn in Pisces in between this. You're seeing the formation of things, and these were great advancements in U.S. history as well. This is a time where we weren't really interested in the rest of the world. We kind of practiced an isolationism, and we were expanding our own country, right? This is a time in the Louisiana Purchase. This is the time where we started to expand west. This is at a time where we were beginning to recognize that there was so much more to this than just the East Coast. So it was border expansion. It was, Lewis and Clark. It was being able to bring people, and I totally know I got that date wrong. Go ahead and comment below. But it was during a time where we were exploring, and we were going to the parts that we hadn't explored yet, right? Because the next time it ran into, Saturn ran into Pisces was from 1846 to 1849. What happened with that, with the expansion of the country? The gold rush. This is when we just rushed over the rest of the country. It also meant a horrible, terrible thing from a structure standpoint, because this is where we kind of sort of treated the Native Americans like absolute garbage, and we've never really reconciled that. We also recognize that now in representative, this is the part where the devil card and the moon card really start to stand out, because you have the dynamic of, we want to form a country, but what's the right thing to do? Did we pay more attention to Saturn, or did we pay more attention to Pisces? Aha! When it came to Native Americans, it was all about the Saturn. Sorry. However, when it came to things like the Age of Enlightenment, we paid more attention to it being in Pisces. So here's two different times where there was advancement, right or wrong, and sometimes the outcome was, hey, we think for ourselves, we think what ifs. And then there's other times where the byproduct was, we can do mean and dastardly things in the name of personal advancement. If your awareness isn't on high here, it should be here pretty quick, right? So moving forward, you've got the idea. Oh, by the way, this is also when Marxism was born. This is where by the way, it's not Richard Marx. Communist Manifesto. By the way, Richard Marx, fantastic musician. Hold on to the night. However, if you're going to write a Communist Manifesto, make sure you do it during a time when Saturn's in Pisces, because it has legs. It has the social construct for it to be. Now, I'm not talking about, socialism or communist manifestos being the right way to go, but it is important to the human psyche and the human advancement to sometimes present what isn't, so you can become concrete with what is. This is a great representation of that time, right? So now let's kind of get us into the 19th century, right? Or into the 20th century, into the more recent history. And let's just jump to 1935 to 38. This was a time where Nazism really got a foothold. And guys, I'm not going to mince words here, because, oh, by the way, the one time before this was in the early 1900s. This is also when we were poisoning presidents in McKinley. This is when we were this is when we were really going nuts with our own industrial revolution. Fast forward, we also had a world war in between it, which set up this perfect time for paradigms to be manipulated. History repeats itself, everybody. Fascism is a thing. Nazism is a thing. Let's not lose sight of this. So which one do you think we paid more attention to, or society paid more attention to, when Saturn went into Pisces during that time? You better believe it was more the devil card. Because the rise of Nazi Germany was a thing. It was beyond a thing, everybody. So from February of 1935 to 1939, or 38 rather, it was incredibly important. Now, we also had a Neptune conjunct with Saturn and Neptune, holy Toledo. So it was the rise of disillusions. So now you've got three factors. Remember what we just talked about, right? So in the societal blend, you really just pay attention. You don't pay attention to the house per se. That's personal. But you do pay attention to what's going on in the sky. So you have Saturn and Neptune in conjunct in Pisces. That is like an overwhelming manipulative fact, where sometimes you're like, well, technically you have Neptune that's ruled by Pisces, and you would think that you have two Piscean energies, style energies versus one construct. And I'll tell you, on a personal level, highly creative time. A little bit of a wishy-washy time. You might not be able to tell where the bottom of the pool is. But when it comes to society, that combination is disillusioned in delusional thinking. That's how somebody like Hitler came to power, everyone, energetically. This is a very important concept as we look into this, because in this current Saturn trip through Pisces, we're going to be dealing with a Neptune conjunct. Anybody else want to review the 2020 elections? Anyone? Anyways, you also had other things that were going on, like the Spanish Civil War. That actually created a ton of instability in Europe, and it actually allowed Hitler to kind of be like, well, isn't this the problem? It was also a time when, just to let you know, and the reason why a lot of people really criticize the Catholic Church for being part of kind of this cabal and this, anti-Pope and all this other stuff. Well, Adolf Hitler was shaking hands with the Pope and making deals so that then Italy would join them in war. Did the church make a deal with the devil? The cards say yes. But on the flip side of that, what we do have to look forward to is that as much as there was all of this strife, as much as this was like, Germany saying Jewish people no longer have citizenship, but they're now, war criminals, or wards of the state, I think is the terminology. And it was the start of eugenic programs. It was massive social change that we had the opportunity to stop. Could we have stopped it along the way? You really do know that was a very important thing. And by the way, all that, a lot of people don't know this from a historical standpoint, but part of the reason why Hitler, and by the way, Saturn in Pisces speaks volumes to this. What Hitler truly talked about wasn't the elimination of Jews, not at first. What he talked about is the preservation of the land. He was talking about Germany being overpopulated, and by proxy, he was basically talking about the immigrants. He basically considered all Jewish people as immigrants, to say that they needed to be expelled to create safe and green space in the country. I mean, what a crock of shit. It was the plausibility of a eugenics program. But this is how powerful Saturn in Pisces is. He was able to create a delusional narrative, especially when Neptune showed up. We're going to talk a little bit more about that a little bit later. But understand that the conversation is ripe for delusional thinking when other planets work into it. Now, Saturn in Pisces, static, there's dynamic tension. Look out when the tension gets not so dynamic, but rather weighted. Well, let's just kind of fast forward, because as you move into, and again, there's a lot of things that actually came out that were actually pretty strong. This is when like creative things were coming about, right? Where we were beginning to tell the tales of the woe in which we had. This is when Steinbeck's work really came out, of Mice and Men and things like that, where people were beginning to conceptualize the Great Depression and understand the human tragedy, right? It's also where creativity really started. This is at a time where not only was Mary Shelley's Frankenstein now being spread all over the world, you also had stories like The Hobbit getting out there and getting all over the place. It's also what born Dr. Seuss, although a byproduct of World War II. Still important to note that creativity was still there. Well, let's fast forward to 1964 to 1967. And by the way, if you were born during this time, guess what? You are going through your Saturn return during this time. At some point, right? Now, during this time, you had a lot of civil unrest. This is when the civil rights marches were happening all over the place. Martin Luther King was coming into power. Things like the Black Panther was squaring off against the Klan, and, all of those social strife. I'm just paying attention to the U.S. right now for a minute. But then what's also happening is that a lot of civil rights acts were kind of coming into being, right? Where we couldn't necessarily have social, discrimination anymore when it came to voting, where all men are created equally, right? You also had things like established Medicaid and Medicare, as well as Social Security. So you started to see the idea of taking care of social issues. Well, during this time of Saturn in Pisces, there was a transit of Pluto. Pluto was in Pisces. So guess what, everybody? There was an empowerment to create social change for something positive. Now, I'm not taking anything away from, that fateful day in Memphis. But what I am talking about is that the movement was incredibly important, right? What was important was that some of these ideas moved forward. The idea of social injustice became a conversation, right? This is also a time when Nelson Mandela stood up in South Africa. So it was something that of like social civil strife was, a global thing. It wasn't just a local thing. You also had Soviet nationalists were actually standing up to the Communist Party. Now, again, it didn't really work. However, the idea of that social construct of standing up to what's not right was a consistent theme during this time, and Pluto really, really helped it. Now, you want to talk about kind of moving into other things that came out of this. Think about it this way. There was also the idea of where tradition started to die. This is when things like rock and roll came into being. This is the time of the Beatles, everybody, 64 to 67. This is when they stepped up. This is when Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Heart Band, where even they were creative within their creative realm, they pushed the boundaries of it. They were writing songs that weren't all necessarily in 4/4 time. They weren't necessarily just playing a guitar, bass, and drums anymore. They were doing things like working with things like penny whistles and organs and backwards music and all that other stuff, and Paul is not dead, right? But then you also have things like Bob Dylan going electric. Sounds small, but think about it. He was a folk singer, and then he in turn said, I'm going to plug in. That was a monumental shift, but it represents the idea that you really had to change the paradigm here, right? We were also going out into space, right? We were being able to, take pictures of the moon in a different way, and the sun and planets and that sort of thing. You also had the rise of Satanism. And again, all hail Capricorn and Pisces. Let's take a look at the man and take a swing at him. Not that it necessarily had legs, and not that they've ever really had strong numbers, but the idea of that counterculture conversation of being able to create duality is happening here. You also have things like the sound of music, the triumphs of a previous challenge coming forward. Just like in 35 to 38, we were talking about the previous generation's, challenge of the Great Depression. Now we're seeing movies and plays. Rodgers and Hammerstein was taking something as complex as Nazism and basically boiling it down to do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do. Yeah, yeah. A lot of fun right there. Um, you also had, this is also when you started to see things like, um, things like Bigfoot sightings. You were beginning to, hear about the Mothman. You were beginning to see a lot of different things with that. Well, now let's take a look at 93 to 96. So May 93 to April 96. Here we go where Neptune rears its head again. Because during this time, this is a time where the Soviet Union is coming off of, they were implementing glasnost. They had announced it a few years earlier under Gorbachev and Reagan, but here we are into a time where this struggle actually allowed us to see this kind of rise of this new Russia, right? This compartmentalized Russia. It was no longer the Eastern Bloc. We were moving into a time of Russia and Estonia and Latvia and Georgia and get to know them all and collect them, right? And Neptune kind of did this thing where it went sextile for a time, and it was a long conjunct, right? But you also didn't just have a Saturn-Neptune sextile for about a year, like about 14 months. You also had Uranus conjunct to Neptune at the beginning of this. So you had this influence of kind of like, here's dream and restriction and rebellion and kind of this disillusionary concept of how this was going to roll for us. Well, this was the last Saturn and Pisces in recent memory leading up to it. Let's talk about some of the things that were going on here. You had the great Yugoslavian massacres, the genocide that was going on there in Bosnia and Croatia, right? Although the war ended in 95, what was the bloodiest time was that 93 to 94. This is when we really kind of had to step in and get Bosnia and Serbia kind of, we kind of had to be the policeman here. NATO kind of had to step in. You also had the Rwanda genocide. So you see where this social strife is really hitting here during these times, right? You also had an unprecedented number of bombings in Israel. Tel Aviv, the West Bank, it was constant. It was constant, right? You also had the idea that cultism was starting to come in. I mean, you had cults in, you had cults that were in Sweden. You had cults in Scotland. You had the Timothy McVeigh bombings. You had, you had David Koresh. You had cultism taking effect. You had the IRA, right? You had Northern Ireland battles going on. You had individual strifes that were happening. You also saw, and by the way, a lot of these strifes were revenge. Another very important revenge during that time was the O.J. Simpson trials. Nicole Simpson lost her life, right? In part during the time of Saturn and Pisces. Not directly, there's other things that are involved with this, but the astrological weather was ripe. And by the way, with that sextile energy, what that is this gentle energy to push the envelope, to push the confusion, to push the duality, to say, you're my wife, but we're not together anymore. But who's the waiter? That's how it affects you on a personal level. Gosh, I should really take a look at OJ for that one. Huh, everybody? Calm down. It's all good. It's also a time of tragedy. The world lost Kurt Cobain. That's the thing, everybody. You also had countries like France gain nuclear power. I mean, no offense, but France's borders are not all that secure. They've been invaded over 40 times in written history. They have been ruled by everybody else. Do we really want that to go down? You also had China developing surface-to-air missiles. You had Israel and Palestine in the peace process, and their prime minister being assassinated. You had a lot of these things that were up against us, but you also had some positive things. You got to take the good, take the bad. This was a time where the Church of England actually acknowledged female priests. How about that for a change in the dynamics? You also had, the Channel Tunnel open, where communication and travel between Europe, mainland Europe and France, over to England, right? You also had, you also had the Prince, not the Prince, but Prince rebelling against structure and basically saying, I'm going to change my name to a signal, to a sign. Go ahead, write that in your contract, bitches, right? I'm now an astrological looking sign, right? This is also when gaming material really kind of took off. Things like PlayStation, Nintendo started to get refined. You also had the, things in social construct. How about X-Files starting? Yeah, it's that old, everybody. 30 years old almost. You also had things like rare art being stolen. You also had photographs of the deepest parts of space being telegraphed back to us from the Hubble's telescope. We had our first clear pictures of Pluto. We knew it was a dot in the sky, but now we could actually see the shape of the surfaces, that sort of thing. We also had advancements in technology. Don't remember that little film, the original Jurassic Park? 30 years ago, everybody. 30 years ago. Where CGI, we were able to reanimate dinosaurs and capture our imagination. So we have technology advances. Sometimes we use them for good, sometimes not for so good, sometimes not for, sometimes just for entertainment, just to kind of distract us, right? This is also when Pixar took off. Toy Story came out. So did Waterworld too, but we're going to kind of leave that one there. But then other, movies and entertainment that changed your paradigm on how you looked at things. That they were telling one story, but they were really talking about social dynamics underneath it. Things like Shawshank Redemption, which was really about how the accused gets caught and then the man figures out how to get over the establishment. That is a huge movie for that. You have things like Forrest Gump. You have things like Pulp Fiction. You have things like The Madness of King George, which was an incredible, story. And then you have things like Immortal Beloved, which captured Beethoven and being able to talk about his story about trying to chase the MacGuffin of who the Immortal Beloved truly was. Was it the music or was it the woman? Oh, God, there's so much stuff. Leaving Las Vegas, the tragedy that was. 12 Monkeys, the idea of, of an outbreak kind of running rampant. So Saturn in Pisces was an amazing time for us to advance. It was also a tragic time for us to take a look at what our social constructs are. What are we going to pay attention to? Again, I've left the Devil card and the Moon card up for a reason. Are we going to look for the constriction? Are we going to look for trying to control things and manipulate things and have it be where the positive side of the Devil card is the structure, the foundation, the discipline, right? The negative of it is the rapture. It's the bondage and being held to things that you're too much accountability, too much responsibility, too much of whatever. And then you have the Moon card, which is about dreams and hopes and, a little delusional, but sometimes you got to daydream in order to get there. Those two things combined actually creates the definition of who we can be during this time in Saturn and Pisces. Well, hope you guys are still stay tuned because I've got more. Up next, we're going to take a look at what your rising sign is going to mean on the personal side of it. Now that we've taken a look at the sociological impact of the very brief history of Saturn in Pisces, let's take a look about what it's going to mean for you on a personal basis. Stay tuned. So this right here is an example of what Saturn return looks like on a chart. It is when Saturn goes around the sun in its 29.4 years, give or take a little bit, depending upon how the retrogrades affect it. But basically, right around your 30th birthday or just before, you experience your first Saturn return. Now, how you line this up is you take not only the minutes and the degrees and the minutes, and that is the exact placement. Now, this is also highly effective when you take a look at the house structure in which you analyze how Saturn is going to affect you. That's why in this video, I'm going to take a look at your rising signs, not necessarily your sun signs, because where your house placement of Saturn is where the focus will be right out of the gate. So you say it's your birthday. Well, it's my birthday too. And guess what? If you were born between May of 93 and June of 93, and then fast forward a little bit to January of 94 and April of 96, well, guess what? You this year are going to be going through your first Saturn return. Now, at 29 and a half years, give or take, depending upon retrogrades, you are experiencing your first Saturn return. Now, what happens during this time? Think back or think ahead to where you think you were at about 30 years old. Well, those are the realistic things that you have to start to face. It's kind of being a grown-up. It's adulting. It's all those things that kind of get in the way of, like, this is the planetary placement that lets you know you need to be a grown-up. And by the way, if you have failure to launch at this point, this is when your parents just throw your stuff out on the front lawn and say goodbye. This is also when that significant other starts to say to you, when are you going to grow up? And it's also the time where you start to balance the idea of money versus like what you actually have, right? In other words, like you start to value things, you start to want to accumulate things, right? You begin to prioritize what your obligations are in this life. Maybe it's a family, maybe it's a job, maybe it's a career, maybe it's still chasing, whatever it is you're chasing and having a good time with it. But it's the time where you start to become concrete in what your obligations are. It is a first step into adulthood, and you begin to do what we call task mastering. In other words, you start to get really good at a couple of things. Maybe it's laundry, which, by the way, drives everybody crazy, or maybe it's your job, which we falsely kind of define ourselves with, or maybe it's about what you really begin to understand within your passions. Now, Saturn returns, the first one actually sits very nicely right in between your Jupiter return at about 24 years old and 36 years old, which is when you really start to kind of take off. But this Saturn return placement allows you to have the concrete footing that you need to help you really launch. Well, you think that's cool. How about if we take a look at the second Saturn? So our Saturn second return is not really a picnic. If you were born between the very tail end of February of 1964 to September of 1964, it just kind of dipped its toe into Saturn in Pisces. And then from December of 1964 to March of 1976, well, congratulations, you're in the midst of your second Saturn returns. Now, what does the second Saturn return mean? Well, this is really kind of stepping into mastery. This is like the ultimate in maturity, right? So you've got Saturn, this planet of concrete notion, this idea of karmic value and lessons and bringing the great teacher forward. Well, this is the application of those lessons. And guess what? It does us a favor because it allows you to prioritize yourself. Yes, you may also come off as the one that sits on the front porch and yells at everybody to get off of your lawn, but there's something else that happens. Whereas the first Saturn return, it's nestled in between two Jupiter returns. With this Saturn return, it also is traditionally conjunct within this year, again, give or take between the ages of 59 and 61, where you run into also your Jupiter return. It'll be your fifth Jupiter return, in case you're keeping track of it at home. But this Saturn return allows you to become concrete and basically take no prisoners. You prioritize yourself. You no longer give a rat's patoot about anybody else. But more importantly, you're able to prioritize your values, your wishes, and who you are in this life. But I've got some tough news. You can't teach an old dog new tricks. You might be a little too set in your ways to actually do anything concrete or non-concrete. So pay attention, and that's why when we take a look at the rising signs, if you can keep it focused to Saturn in your return sign, well, right now, it's really important because you were actually born at a time of conflict. Now, let's take a look at the history of Saturn in Pisces and some of the world events that might have happened. You know, like say your birthday. You're welcome. All right, everybody, welcome back. Why not start with Pisces? Usually, typically, they're the last to go. I should know because, well, I'm bringing up the rear. Well, listen, Pisces, you get to go first here because this is truly happening in your Pisces rising. This is your first house. And by the way, what we're about to take a look at is the rising signs, because as much as you can take a look at how it can affect you natally, you still have to pay attention to which house it is that it's going to happen in. So what we do know, you always look for the primer. What is your rising? This is why we need to know your time when we do your astrological chart, which you can totally book by clicking the link below. And by the way, if you haven't liked and subscribed by now, shame on you. What are you doing? You should like, subscribe, and share with 20 of your friends. You can also become a member and really kind of help this channel if you like this content. But let's talk about what the first house represents and what the houses represent. Well, the houses in astrology actually focus in on each part of your life. This helps us really kind of truly understand how it is that we work and operate in the social experiment called humanity. Or you might have a different set of skills for, say, dealing with communications or with dealing with knowledge or how it is that you interact with people and how you work on relationships. Each one of the houses actually represent a different part of your life, and sometimes you have the cards stacked for you, and sometimes they're stacked against you, and sometimes it just shows up. So this is why we're going to take a look at if your rising sign is in a particular sign, then here you go. And by the way, if you don't know what that is, go ahead and sign up for a reading with me today. Not only do we go over your triad, which is your sun, moon, rising, but we also go over all of your house placements to help you understand what your strengths are. Maybe you're trying to figure out what your purpose is. Maybe you're trying to figure out why you have difficult relationships with certain people in your life, like, say, siblings or parents or children. Or maybe you're just trying to find your way. What am I really here for? All those things you can tell within a chart. And this is one of the places that we'll start here. With Saturn in Pisces, obviously, this is your first house as your rising. So we're talking to Pisces rising right here. Here's what you have to look forward here in this year during this transition, because it will be in your first house all year long, right? This is about your personal identity. This is about your physical presence. This is about you being able to build up who you really are. Now, listen, this is about you confronting situations where it might have been muddy for a long time. This is your opportunity to begin to pull on that and take all of your experiences and start to transform. You're going to be highly creative. You're going to be highly empathetic, and you're going to have spiritual advancements. Good job by you, Pisces, because you're really pulling your weight here. All right, Aries, you're so used to being first, and then you go second, and then guess what? We push you right to the back of the line. We have a little bit of an anomaly because of the sizes of the house. And by the way, we don't go whole houses around here. We'd like to take a look at the Placidus, the Placidus, if you will. And guess what? Your Saturn is going to be sitting in the 11th house for most of it. This is about focusing in on your connections. It's also about letting you slow down a little bit. You've had this fast-paced thing, and you're definitely going to be paying attention to the Capricorn nature of Saturn in this. You're not really comfortable with a ton of creative stuff. That doesn't mean you're not creative. What it does mean is that you're going to focus in on none other than the best relationship you can have, which is with yourself. What do you need out of other relationships? This is a great time of growth for you, Aries. It's also an idea that you really have to let your imagination part of it come in. So as much as you're going to be a little bit restrictive, it's not about creativity so much as it is about imagination. It's okay to dream. Just don't get delusional. Because Aries, it's very unbecoming for you when you get delusional, if you will. It's a great time for greater projects, for social issues for you. Go ahead and take them by the horns and go wrestle it. Go Aries rising. All right, Taurus rising. This is a great placement for you. You have the savvy Earth energy of Saturn, which I know that that's kind of weird that I just said Earth is like Saturn, but being ruled by Capricorn, there it is. It's kind of a 2-against-1 flavor, if you will, but it's really about your hopes and dreams and connection to your organic growth and things, right? You're actually in a position and at the dichotomy part of this to be in the 11th house as well. It's one of the few times where your passage starts and ends in that same house. Now, Aries will eventually move into the 12th house, as a rising sign. But Taurus, get comfortable with this kind of ability to create with your shared talents. This is about you sharing who you are. The greater good is going to get there, but your practicality could get in the way. But you're going to do it for foundation, and you're going to use it for good. You're going to pay attention to a little bit more of the Pisces part of this, because there's something kind of intriguing, because you're going to have fun with this. This is actually going to be a time for you, Taurus rising, to really get going. Now, the challenge might be is if you start questioning yourself. There is no time for imposter syndrome. This is a time for you to believe in what you're doing and go do it. Go Taurus rising. All right, Gemini rising. You have kind of hit the lottery with all these placements. You know, you're known for your wishy-washiness, but when Saturn moves into your 10th house, it's a Capricorn on Capricorn action, if you know what I'm saying. High creativity, high communication. There's a fortunate placement here because you're about to really advance in your career over the next 3 years, Gemini rising. You're going to have the ability to be able to put your goals into action. Now, Gemini, you get a bad rap, and I'm going to defend you here. You've been building up for something very strong for you to really put your best foot forward. By the way, this is the time to put your best foot forward. Listen, if you're going to sit around and be a flibberty gibbet, then I can't help you in the end of 3 years. But you're going to need this because you're going to move into Taurus after this. And Taurus and Gemini energy isn't always the best. So once we get past these couple of 3 years, you're going to really kind of be in coast mode for practicality. You should be in the mode for molding these ideas and these advancements that you have. But you got to do the work now. You got to start early because some of these challenges that you're going to face are going to be in overcoming some of the other things that you used to do, some of the reputation that you might have had, or some of the other, compassionate things of like, oh, well, they're a Gemini. They don't really, they don't really care and they don't really take offense to it. It's time to really stand your ground. It's time for you to be recognized. It's time for you to be diligent. It's time for you to show the world, Gemini rising, that you are meant to have a place at the table in your career and make an impact on the world. Go do it. All right, Cancer rising. How you doing, my old friends? This precarious position here in the 9th house just upsets you. It upsets the apple cart a little bit. Although you appreciate the energy of it being in Pisces, the idea that you have to expand gets you out of your comfort zone. That's the bad news. The good news is that you're really going to enjoy it because it's doing a deep dive and understanding how the world works around you. Maybe it's playing around with spirituality. Maybe it's working with the idea that the what ifs could actually become probablys. You're going to really kind of expand. You might expand through travel. You might expand through knowledge. You might take a look around the world. But if you're a Cancer rising, this is a great placement for you to finally get off the couch, to worry about other things than just your domestic duties. It's time for you to take a look at the rest of the world and recognize that. And although it's for a relatively short period of time, 3 years isn't all that much, this is a great time for you to get out there and say, hey, remember the time we did this? Because Cancer rising, that's how you roll. You love to talk about the past as an experience, but this is the time to gain that experience. Go live a little, Cancer rising. It's your time. Hello, Leo risings. How are we today? I think you look wonderful as always. Little flattery never got you anywhere, huh? Well, guess what? This Saturn in Pisces is actually in your 8th house. This is a Scorpion energy, so you kind of got water on water action going here. But the structure of things really plays well to your fiery energy, Leo rising. You've got to take a look at this from the standpoint of the heaviness that you're probably dealing with, right? Saturn makes it a little bit heavy here. Remember how we talked a little bit about sometimes when they gang up on each other, it creates a little confusion? Well, this is really kind of what's going to happen to you here. Your psyche's going to take a little bit of a hit, but it's going to kind of right size you. Maybe you're a little over your skis. Maybe you're kind of like in a position where you're recognizing that all the other good things that are coming into it are actually a really positive thing, right? So you also begin to recognize that intimacy has to be held at a high value. In other words, it's just not a fly by night thing. It's something where when you spend time with people and when you connect your energies to them, it matters. It's not just kind of a fly by night thing anymore. You're also going to be recognizing how money works in a different way. You're going to recognize what you need in this life and where it is that you're going to be headed to. It could also mean a windfall for things like inheritances, but you're going to redesign how you look at energy. The 8th house is really about manifesting an energetic value, energy in things like your physical well-being, in terms of money, in terms of time, that sort of thing. This is going to be a time that might slow you down a little bit because nobody likes to put baby in a corner. But in this case, it's for your own good because you're redesigning how valuable you are to others. Don't forget that, Leo rising. Now's your time. All right, Virgo rising. Let's have a moment of honesty. Relationships aren't always your strongest suit. Sometimes you kind of make it about you. But this Saturn and Pisces placement is actually sitting in your 7th house. So guess what? Dynamic tension for you to grow. This is a really cool placement for you because this is a growth period that you're going to see your relationships be valued for what they are, not necessarily what they're at. You're going to get some major lessons out in life here. You're going to really kind of begin to understand that value of time and energy and not always necessarily put into it what you're not getting out of it. But then you're also going to understand who's really there for you. This is a 3-year transit that will completely define your friendships. It'll also lose some in the process, so be ready. You'll also realize your own BS. That's kind of a thing, Virgo. You'll also recognize that maybe you did things wrong in the past and maybe you have to tweak that. Whatever it is, this dynamic tension is giving you the opportunity to grow. And Virgo rising, I'm pretty sure you're going to take it because that's what you like to do. Roll up your sleeves and find solutions. Go to it, Virgo. Oh gosh, Libra rising, how are you, good friends? Listen, Libras and Libra risings have been going through a little bit of turmoil. We've been doing the old turn the bucket, if you will. Maybe you've been going through a little bit of upheaval. But listen, this is a time where this Saturn is transiting through your 6th house. This is about routine. So if you're feeling a little, discombobulated, this is actually a little bit of a godsend. This is going to be your idea of saying, well, this worked, but this didn't. You're going to be creating new routines. That means you might play around with some things. You might begin to start a new routine or a new diet or be able to take a look at something where it's like, well, I've heard this is good and I'm going to try this. You're going to want to try a bunch of different things, but have enough discipline to recognize whether it's going to work or not. This is a really important thing because sometimes we try things and it just doesn't work or it's just not for us because we didn't put enough time into it or we didn't do it right. Well, Libra, this placement actually talks about you doing it right. This is about bringing in a discipline and a focus to what you want to do and how you want to do it. As a Libra rising, everybody looks at you to bring balance into things. Well, guess what? You are absolutely going to walk into this. You're going to want to coast so that then you can do your projects behind the scenes. You're going to want to just have work be a paycheck for a while. And that's okay because you've earned the right to coast a little bit because you're working on other things. That's what makes you so good, Libra rising. All right, Scorpio rising. There's a couple of magical components here as Saturn goes through Pisces. And guess what? The fifth house is yours. So, as Scorpio in the rising position, the fifth house is about the creativity. Listen, you've been known to hang on to things from time to time a little too tightly. This is going to let you loosen up. You're going to have some fun now. This transition is going to be you playing with new ideas. Now, I don't want to put pressure on you here, Scorpio rising, but we are looking for some innovation here. This is a great innovative placement. And actually, moreover, don't be surprised if you push your own limits. Don't let the Scorpio rising thing fool you. You're not necessarily hung up on all of this, to feel the pressures of things. And you might feel pressure at this time to be like, I have to come up with this, because you take on sincere responsibility here as a fixed sign. But what you also have to recognize is that you are destined for this. You have other placements that have allowed you to bring yourself to fruition. And right now, have a little fun with it. Don't get caught up in lost time or anything else. It's all for the greater good. We expect some innovation out of you here, Scorpio rising, in the next couple of years. This Saturn placement in Pisces is incredibly important. And guess what? You're going to kick ass and take names. We're watching. All right, Sagittarius risings. Footloose and fancy free, ain't you? Not so fast. You've got the Capricorn-ruled Saturn rolling through Pisces, and it happens to be your fourth house. Guess what? A little bit of bondage here to the family responsibility is destined. Maybe it's taking care of a parent. Maybe it's taking care of a child, or maybe it's just keeping the home fires burning. Sagittarius rising, this is a little bit of a challenging placement, but don't think that you're necessarily going to be losing out in it. Maybe this is a way to fulfill your karmic duty here in your mission and the things that you're supposed to accomplish on this trip around the earth. Maybe you're also looking for getting to the root of things. This is a great time to do some genealogy, too. It's a great time to understand what kind of family healing that needs to happen. With that creative tension, with that dynamic tension of Saturn in Pisces, this is going to give you the ability to be able to pull things apart and to be able to recognize that your destiny and your connection to your family was no mistake. You asked to be part of this family, Sagittarius rising. Now's your chance to understand it. Now listen, don't compromise yourself during this time, or at least not too much. Don't put yourself out without boundaries, but that doesn't mean that you can't fulfill your obligation. It's a great time for your karmic value, and it doesn't mean that it's not a pain in the neck sometime, but know that it's not all bad. Just know that it's all obligation. You can still go on that trip. You just got to make sure mom and dad are taken care of. It's that sort of feel. Keep going there, Sagittarius rising. Have fun. All right, Cappy Cap, it's time to kiss the goat. Capricorn rising. You've always kind of taken your cue from Saturn, haven't you? Right? It is your ruling planet, and it does just bring a sense of well-being, a sense of purpose, a sense of structure. And then you end up in the third house, and you're forced to take the microphone and talk. What the hell are you going to do now, Capricorn in Pisces in your third house? Well, let me tell you a little bit more about what it is that you're going to do. You're going to think and communicate differently during these next 3 years. You're going to stand in your truth, and you're going to find that power, and you're going to be creative about it. Defying logic about 2 against 1. When the two things are merged that are similar, in this case, Saturn and Capricorn, you're left to the devices of the house and the actual sign. So the third house representing communication, a little bit of Gemini energy. And then you also have Pisces, which is highly creative. Now for you, you're going to find new structure in how you communicate. That includes standing up for yourself. That also includes with new ways of thinking. You may also have some sibling challenges here with this. In other words, siblings may think that they're in charge or they don't really see a greater good outcome. And you may have to kind of put your foot down. This is a very important time for you. These 3 years are also going to give you what we love to call in the spiritual work discernment. When to talk, when to be quiet, and when to go make up your own rules. Because after all, Capricorn, you love a good set of rules. You might be a little more reserved about your communication, but you're going to be clearer. So in other words, say less, but be more potent. Use big words and complete sentences. And don't be afraid of being authentic, Capricorn rising. This is your time. All right, Aquarius, thanks for rounding us out here today. And I got some really good news for you. This second house placement of Saturn and Pisces is just what the doctor ordered. Chances are, Aquarius rising, over the last year, 2 years, you've really struggled with finding a place for your discernment. Well, now you get to actually take what you've been dabbling in and make it more concrete. This will be a time where you put structure behind your hopes and dreams, all those things that you've been building up to. Maybe you've been doing things like weeding yourself out of groups and moving yourself towards passion. Maybe you've been acknowledging certain things and ignoring other things. You insert whatever it is that you've been doing, but this discernment trail has kind of been working for a while. Now you get to apply it to the practicality of your next move. Now, over the next 3 years with this placement, it will give you the opportunity to bring you to where you need to. Now, you yourself have just moved out of the first house of Saturn, so you've done a lot of work with yourself. Saturn was in Aquarius, everybody. And for you, it was in your first house. So that's leading up to the work that you did on yourself, now into the practicality of your launch. Just like Pisces is benefiting on this with being in the first house, you benefited in Saturn being in Aquarius in the first house for the last almost 3.5 years. But for you, now that it moves into the second house, you're going to look at your value, your self-value, and you're going to build structure around valuing your time. This is a great time to be a light worker and step out and get money for the value that you bring. It's also something to get value for your thoughts, your ideas. This is a great time to become a teacher, an artist, a musician. Now is the time that your voice can be heard because it's going to have structure. You're just not going to do it as a hobby. Oh, and guess what? You're going to come out way ahead, Aquarius rising. Everything's about to pay off with this awesome placement. Because don't forget, your secondary ruling planet is Saturn. Winner, winner, chicken dinner. It's like you just won the lottery. This is how I'm ending the video. I'll see you guys soon. We're going to give you guys a heart tap to remind you that we care and love for each other, and to remind you to simply keep going, because this journey of Saturn and Pisces is a journey of us becoming and challenging who we are as a society and who we are as a person. Where do we need structure? Where do we need creativity? This is a great time of discernment and growth. And we'll have other updates, in particular when Neptune affects how Saturn operates. That 2 against 1 is actually a negative. And see how Saturn starts to run rampant. We'll be given that update a little bit later on in the year as Neptune makes its move into Pisces, or in conjunct to Saturn. All right, guys, remember that heart tap, and we're going to see you next time. For Stream of Consciousness, this has been an extended version, and we give each other the heart tap and remind each other to simply keep going, as I said. Take care, guys.